Okay, so thank you for joining. I'm really excited to have the ONDRI team here today to present. I am a member of the Patient and Community Advisory Committee for ONDRI, and one of the key objectives of our group is to share and help promote the engagement of others with the ONDRI and to really get others involved in research and understanding how that can happen. So today we have three main objectives for you. So the objectives for today's presentation are really first to share the story of ONDRI, past, present, and future, to highlight the unique ONDRI opportunities or research implications for dementia care, the dementia care community, and also, and perhaps most importantly, to highlight the opportunities for you to participate and to help connect your clients to the ONDRI research when appropriate and applicable. And so to help introduce the ONDRI team members, I'm going to turn over the stage to Ruth Kruger, the strategist for communication and stakeholder relations. And Ruth, thank you for being here today, and I'll turn it to you.
Thanks so much, Christina, and thanks so much for having us here today, and welcome everybody. We have the honor of having our three leads of ONDRI here today with us. Dr. Mario Masalas, first, is a clinician scientist in neurology at Sunnybrook Health Science Centers. He also serves as director of the Cognitive and Movement Disorders Clinic at Sunnybrook. Dr. Masalas focuses on the diagnosis and treatment of Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's Lewy body disorders, and frontotemporal dementia spectrum disorders. He investigates these diseases using genetic and neuroimaging measures to understand complex mechanisms leading to manifestations of dementia and motor problems. Dr. Masalas is an associate professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. Second, we have Dr. Richard Swartz. Dr. Richard Swartz is a stroke neurologist and clinician scientist at Sunnybrook Health Science Center, who focuses on vascular cognitive impairment and improving long-term stroke outcomes. Dr. Swartz serves as medical director of the Sunnybrook and the Northeast GTA Regional Stroke Programs, as well as director of the Sunnybrook Stroke Research Unit and the vice chair of research for the Canadian Stroke Consortium. Dr. Swartz is an associate professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. And last but not least, we have Dr. Doug Munoz. Dr. Doug Munoz obtained his PhD in neurology and neurosurgery at McGill University, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Eye Institute in the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Munoz is an expert in using eye tracking to study brain diseases. He is the Canada Research Chair in Neuroscience and Professor in Biomedical and Molecular Science, Psychology and Medicine at Queen's University. Thank you and welcome everybody, and we'll start off with Dr. Masalas.
Great. I'd like to first start off by thanking Christina and the Alzheimer Society for organizing this today, and also Ruth for the introduction. Rick and Doug are very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today about our research program, which is part of the Ontario Brain Institute. And the research program is called the Ontario Neurodegenerative Disease Research Initiative. But first, I'll give you a bit of a background about our funding body and what this organization, the Ontario Brain Institute, is hoping to achieve through funding these research programs. So first of all, it's funded by the Ontario government, and the Ontario Brain Institute is hoping to improve the lives of Ontarians living with a brain disorder. Not only neurodegenerative diseases, but also diseases like cerebral palsy, epilepsy, neurodevelopmental disorders, depression, as well as concussion. And these are the programs on the left side of the slide that look at these different disorders. The idea here is that they want to create seamless connections between research discovery, patient care, and commercialization through these 6 programs. And then we also want to be able to connect researchers, patients, companies, and policymakers together. The reason why the approach to look at not just one brain disease, but to look at all of the major brain diseases or several of the major brain diseases is that there are many overlaps across these different disorders. And this is going to be a recurring theme during this talk today. And so the overlaps are that patients, for example, who suffer from Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease, who participate in the ONDRI program, may have symptoms of depression, which can overlap with patients that have primary depressive disorders without this. We know that, for example, depression is a risk factor for late life depression. So people in their, for example, 50s or 60s who never had depression when they were younger, if they develop depressive symptoms in their 60s, that's a very, very strong warning factor that we need to be looking for the onset of a neurodegenerative disorder such as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease as the most common ones. So the idea here is that if we can collect data across all of these different disorders and collect them in the same database, we can start to look at the links between and the links and relationships between these different disorders, and that will help us to understand, for example, risk factors across the lifespan for neurodegenerative diseases. And so we are establishing collaborations. We don't only work within our own little silo of ONDRI, but we establish collaborations with all of these other groups in order to better understand risk factors across the lifespan for neurodegenerative disease. And this will help us to understand mechanisms towards the disease, which will allow us to potentially in the future develop intervention programs to prevent the onset of these diseases. So what is the Ontario Neurodegenerative Disease Research Initiative? And I'll use the acronym ONDRI from here. So this is a unique pan-Ontario research program that recognizes the complexity and mixed nature of dementia, motor disorders, and other neurodegenerative diseases, and it's designed to address these complexities head on. I think that, I know that here we're talking to the Alzheimer Society of Canada, and as you all know, Alzheimer's disease is the most prevalent neurodegenerative disease that causes dementia. However, if you develop dementia, which is having memory problems and thinking difficulties that affect and impair your day-to-day functions, if you develop dementia over the age of 65, there have been many community-based studies that have followed individuals over the age of 65 longitudinally and looked at those that went on to develop dementia, and they even studied them until autopsy. And upon autopsy, when you look at their brains, while many of them had Alzheimer's disease, the reality was many also had Lewy body pathology, which is the pathology we see in Parkinson's disease. Many of them had what we call small vessel disease, or even small infarcts or strokes in the brain. And so the reality is that when we talk about dementia as an entity, while in the old way of thinking, we used to think that most causes of dementia were purely due to Alzheimer's disease, the reality is that if you have late onset dementia after the age of 65, you're more than likely to have Alzheimer's disease plus a few other pathologies that are contributing. And so this leads to the ONDRI mission statement, is that we want to catalyze advances in dementia, which is a complex syndrome due to multiple neurodegenerative diseases plus cerebrovascular disease, in order to improve the diagnosis, prognosis, care, and outcomes for persons living with these diseases and those who support them. And so what makes ONDRI unique? In many countries around the world, including the US, you might have heard of the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. And so this is a longitudinal study that recruited patients with mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease and followed them over time. And so they looked at different measures such as brain imaging, such as cognitive testing, blood studies looking at biomarkers, and genetic studies. And in studying this, we learned a lot about Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment as causes for dementia. But these patients in this study were highly selected to be most likely to have Alzheimer's disease, but they don't represent the real world of dementia. And so what makes ONDRI unique is that this is a deep study of people with lived experiences of 5 diseases that can lead to dementia. So not just Alzheimer's disease and the prodromal syndrome of mild cognitive impairment, but we also include patients with Parkinson's disease with and without cognitive impairment, and patients that have had strokes with and without cognitive impairment. And I'll go into the different diseases in a bit more detail. And the idea here is that we can leverage small science expertise along 7 highly specialized assessment platforms at multiple labs with dozens of collaborating clinician scientists to better understand how these diseases can individually contribute to the development of dementia, but also in combination lead to the development of dementia. And then ultimately, we want to use this data that's collected for big science discovery to look at a huge repository of data together with curated, cleaned, and proprietary big data techniques to better understand these relationships and interrelationships across these neurodegenerative diseases and cerebrovascular disease and how they lead to the dementia. So this was the purpose of ONDRI 1, where we looked at very specific neurodegenerative diseases and studied them in a very deep way. ONDRI 2, which is taking place now and of which Doug and Rick and I are the co-leads on, is trying to drive this research further, focusing on dementia and related motor disorders. Many patients who have Alzheimer's disease and dementia can go on to develop Parkinsonism, for example, because they can often have Lewy body disease combined or with the Alzheimer's disease. And so in the next phase, what we want to do is move from this kind of deep data science approach, where we looked at about just over 500 individuals in a very, very deep way along several different platforms. We want to move to looking at a larger group of individuals, both those with these diseases and those also at risk for developing these diseases, using a kind of a more efficient data collection platform. And Rick is going to be discussing this in a little bit more detail later on. But what we're trying to do is to develop a leaner, meaner, more efficient way of collecting data, looking at sensor devices that can be applied at home. And this data is put into a repository. This data, we want to link it to existing databases, such as health services databases, such as the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences. And in combining this big data, which is more what we call, some deep big data combined with what we call broad big data, we hope to be able to learn from what was discovered at ONDRI 1 and link it with these newer data, novel data approaches in a bigger way, so that we can understand more about risk to developing dementia, and do this in collaboration with the other Ontario Brain Institute independent discovery platforms. During ONDRI 1, what we did was we set out to collect patients across all of these disorders: cerebral vascular disease, frontotemporal dementia, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, mild cognitive impairment, and ALS. The pathology of ALS, while this is mostly a motor disorder, many patients with ALS can go on and show signs of frontotemporal dementia, and the brain pathology microscopically overlaps strongly with frontotemporal dementia. So we can look across all of these diseases on many platforms. So we collect clinical data, clinical information like rating scale scores for stroke, rating scale scores for Parkinson's. We collected genomics data. We collected neuropsychological data, which is like cognitive testing data. We collected data on gait and balance. So we had patients walking up and down a gait map and assessing how their walking is. Doug is an expert at eye tracking, and through eye tracking, we can probe specific neural circuits that can be affected in these disorders within the brain. And we also looked at retinal imaging, because the retina is the window to the brain, and pathology within the retina can sometimes be indicative of pathology within the brain. So we can not only look within these diseases across these different data platforms, but we can look within a particular data platform across all of these diseases. And not only did we collect data at baseline, which is the front of this ONDRI Rubik's Cube, but we also looked at data longitudinally over time, at baseline, at year 1 and year 2. We never went on to collect year 3 data in many subjects because when we transitioned to ONDRI 2, the funding was cut. So we do, though, have valuable longitudinal data at 2 follow-up time points over time. So we can look at data, once again, within a disease, across these different platforms, between diseases, but we can also look at data across all of these diseases in a blinded fashion, which allows us to understand synergies between these different disorders. So this is the ONDRI Rubik's Cube, and this is what we were collecting as part of ONDRI 1. So just to show you, we had 520 participants collected at baseline. We had excellent longitudinal retention over time. In red, we collected data from 161 patients with cerebrovascular disease at baseline, and then during follow-up, you can see there was some loss, but not a lot. We collected data on about 50 subjects with frontotemporal dementia, about 140 subjects with Parkinson's disease, 126 subjects with Alzheimer's and mild cognitive impairment, and 40 subjects with ALS. And we collected data over time. For the Alzheimer's disease MCI cohort, we had fairly good subject retention. This slide is a bit confusing because I discussed we had only three visits: a baseline visit, a longitudinal visit at time point 1, and at time point 2, which were 1-year follow-ups for Alzheimer's and MCI. But we did collect data via telephone along the way. And so when we talk about these subsequent visits, this would be the original baseline visit here. And then here we would have, this would be a telephone visit, and then we'd have data at year 1, and then we'd have data at year 2. And you can see that our subject retention over time was relatively good. And patients with neurodegenerative diseases do drop out of these studies because their cognition gets worse. So this is not unanticipated, and so our retention rate was still excellent despite this. If you go to the next slide, this breaks it down in a bit more detail, just showing individuals who completed the study after many visits, and so our retention was quite good. Now I'm going to pass this over to Rick to talk about the second phase of ONDRI, and where I've gone through where we were at, and now he's going to go through where we're going in the future. So thanks very much for your attention, and Rick, if you can take over from here.
Thanks very much, Mario. And again, as Mario said, thank you for having us. We're excited to have the opportunity to reach out and connect with you guys. Our current phase of ONDRI is a 5-year program, 2018 to 2023, that really is looking at building on the foundation that Mario was describing, but expanding the mandate to include really strong integrated knowledge translation. So part of the conversations that we're having today, right? Reaching out to patients, caregivers, healthcare organizations, volunteer organizations, and advocates to try to help the knowledge that we're gaining have greater impact both in the research community but also in care and practice. Facilitating commercialization is a priority for OBI more broadly, so that we can get innovations to the people for whom those innovations really matter. And then working with government and policymakers to advocate for change and improvements, especially in areas where we've been able to make discoveries, and in areas that go across neurodegenerative disorders. So I think it's really valuable. Each of our partner organizations, like Alzheimer Society, like Heart and Stroke Foundation, have powerful lobbying and advocacy programs for disease-specific issues. But if we can speak together as one voice, representing a even broader population of vulnerable people, we might be able to affect greater change for issues that really span neurodegenerative diseases. And our current, pandemic that we're living in really emphasizes that. The vulnerability of physical distancing and the threat of social isolation really go across disorders and impact patients and caregivers and family members quite dramatically, whether the primary disorder is Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or heart or stroke. These kinds of issues really span disorders, and it's much more about how can we identify common solutions and implement them to help affect change. And that's really where bringing together the Patient and Community Advisory Committee that Christina was talking about at the very beginning, and having persons with lived experience, be it as their own lived experience with one of these conditions, or as a carer or family member of somebody with these conditions, really has an integrated voice in all of these activities, right from the research to the knowledge translation and advocacy and innovation. So we are really focused on producing and developing building pieces that can support our core activities and on which we can launch new projects, building on the strengths that we have in Ontario with publicly funded healthcare system, diverse health services, We have worldwide experts in genetics and imaging, in pragmatic clinical trial design, and in epidemiology that we're building together and really trying to integrate into primary care. So as Mario was alluding, take the kind of assessments that we've been doing in very intensive ways and move them into more naturalistic environments where they matter. And that's in the home, in the community, in the real world, instead of just in the lab. And this idea of a living lab and integrated learning healthcare system is really what we're trying to develop and promote. So we have several different aims within ONDRI. Within our ONDRI 2.0, the first we call mining the gold, and that is really taking that Rubik's Cube of detailed assessments across diseases over time on multiple different platforms and using it to advance discovery. The deep characterization that we did, looking at what are markers that predict not just disease and decline, but predict health and stability for persons with neurodegenerative diseases. And I think this is sort of the key of the ONDRI 1, and we want to take that data and maximize it. So we had patients and family members spend, literally hours, literally several days actually volunteering every year, undergoing MRIs and detailed cognitive testing and gait and balance and all the different platforms, eye tracking that Mario had alluded to earlier. And that is a treasure trove, a very rich resource of data that not only Ontario scientists are benefiting from now, but after the 1-year embargo period for our Ontario scientists to maximize the use of the data, we're going to be releasing this to the world. And that's going to be with the consent of our participants and the requirement actually of our funders is that we do this. We take anonymized data, so we don't obviously release things that could be identified. Genetic code information is not released, and MRIs where you can reconstruct faces is not released. So we take great care in preserving the anonymity and the privacy of our volunteers. But the processed data is going to be released to the world so that people can undertake really innovative and interesting correlations and studies looking at things that might predict function or dysfunction, stability or decline, commonalities across diseases, and differences between the diseases. So this really rich data set is a key focus of AIM 1. AIM 2 we call ONDRI at Home, which is developing feasible and scalable markers of disease and decline and health and stability that are feasible to move into the community, into the home, that we can take the kinds of work we're doing in ONDRI and make it more naturalistic and make it easier for participants to provide the data. And that will develop information that can be used to help manage or self-manage disease and decline. It can be used for discovery, and it can be used to characterize people who may be interested in participating in research and helping to advance the next discovery, the next intervention, be it behavioral interventions or medical interventions. So these clinical trials ready cohorts can come out of this program. AIM 3, we call validation through collaboration. So this is, ONDRI went, as Mario described, across these disorders, and there are other databases that have very specific interests. So ADNI, the Alzheimer's Neuroimaging Initiative, or PPMI, which is a Parkinson's disease detailed characterization study. We can actually take the things that we've done in Alzheimer's disease and compare it to ADNI findings, or in Parkinson's disease and compare it to PPMI. But we can also look across our diseases in ways that these other databases and resources are unable to do. And so that's really what AIM 3 is, integrating our efforts with those worldwide and even nationally. So the CCNA, the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging, actually built their protocol on ONDRI so that we can talk to one another and compare results. So their detailed characterization study going across diseases was built on and inspired by a lot of the work that we did in AIM 1. And then in AIM 4, we've built a whole process for looking at health services research, looking at how people are using the healthcare system, when people go to hospital, when people might be admitted to long-term care. And that's both for ONDRI participants, but more globally, more broadly across the healthcare system in Ontario. And this helps us to assess costs of care and impact of pandemics, or impact of healthcare decision-making, or impact of financial investments. And we can actually start to use this as an outcome as we're looking to move into the home and be more scalable, collect data on larger numbers of people, we can no longer necessarily have to have people come back to the clinic for follow-up. We might be able to follow up pragmatic outcomes and important outcomes for people through administrative data sets. And one of the reasons that's really important in research when you want to look over time, longitudinally, as Mario was alluding to earlier, one of the hardest things to do, you saw people, we had excellent retention in our study, but people do fall out of the study, and that can be for health reasons or motivation reasons, or they move away. But by following people through administrative data sets, we can really understand if people do pass away or get admitted to long-term care, they're no longer lost from the study. They're actually a result, and can help us understand what happens to people, so that the people who are the most vulnerable or the highest risk aren't dropped from the study. They're still a part of it. And so building these different aims, they sound separate, but as you're going to see, we're actually trying to build these each as individual areas of discovery and then use them together to advance and accelerate our research. So some examples from AIM 1 of mining the gold. We have a couple of papers, one that's just come out, one that's about to go into a journal right now. The one that's about to go in by Derek Beaton and colleagues is looking at the caregiver burden of our disorders, looking across these disorders and at factors that predict and impact on the burden on caregivers. This is an understudied area in neurodegenerative research, and that is the impact not just on persons living with the disorders, but on the persons trying to support them and care for them, living with them, or perhaps neighbors, friends, colleagues who are supporting. And the areas that are of most concern across different domains, across our neurodegenerative diseases. This really highlights some of the uniqueness of the ONDRI data. Another study that has been released that a former student of mine put out, Aru Kapoor, looking at brain MRI, and that we are not using MRI enough in the diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease, especially early in the disease, when we may have an opportunity to initiate prevention strategies for other pathologies. So as Mario was talking, small strokes or changes in the white matter and the connections of the brain can actually accelerate or unmask Alzheimer's disease problems that make the symptoms much worse. So even though the stroke symptoms aren't bad, sometimes they're even silent, they don't cause any clinical symptoms. We call those covert strokes because they're kind of sneaky. They can actually result in a much greater acceleration and a much more severe expression of symptoms. And we found in a Canadian population, when healthcare is paid for and in academic centers where people were referred for ONDRI, we still found 15% of people had pathologies like strokes that could have been contributing to their disorder that were missed with standard clinical imaging, which often includes just a CT scan. And so a standardized MRI scan can pick up a lot more features that might change management. We might start somebody on an aspirin or reduce their blood pressure or check for atrial fibrillation, which is like dementia, exponentially more prevalent as we age. And so these kinds of conditions can actually change the long-term trajectory of patients. And we've shown that MRI is underutilized in the clinics with ONDRI data. And then we also looked at clinical trials and showed that in research studies that are trying to target Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment, only half of the studies actually required an MRI to get into the study. So we're not actually necessarily treating the people we want to be treating or studying the people we want to study in these clinical trials if we're not imaging more routine. Those are just a couple of examples of how we've mined the gold, and we have several more papers that we can talk about that are already out or coming out, but I don't want to, we could give a whole hour talk just on that, and I want to make sure we give the breadth of what we're doing. So in AIM 2, I talked about using these innovative technologies to move to the home, to the community, to the real world, instead of only studying people who are able to come in and spend 4 hours a day for 2 or 3 days doing neuropsychological testing and gait and balance and eye tracking, MRIs and so on. So we are building these kind of remote monitoring tools that will help us improve diagnosis, prognosis, care, and outcomes. REMIND was our pilot study that we've now completed, showing that people can actually tolerate multiple sensors on their bodies, and more importantly, how we can actually get those sensors to talk to one another, and perhaps what the minimum sensor burden is that we can impose on people, because we don't want to be a futuristic robotic world where we're all wired up from head to toe. That's not the idea. And yet a Fitbit or an Apple Watch may not provide us with enough information or enough details to really take advantage of the possibilities of biosensors and wearable monitors. So we're launching a new protocol that I'm going to, HANDS Ontario, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, is coming up in a couple of slides. So I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. In AIM 3, I talked about positioning ONDRI in the context of these other local, national, and international efforts. And, you know, kind of we'll validate your findings if you validate our findings kind of a deal with other international programs like ADNI, like PPMI, like the Rotterdam study, like CCNA. It's a virtual alphabet soup of efforts. But I think the important thing here is recognizing that in Ontario, we are part of the conversation. Hopefully we will be leaders in the conversation, but this is a broad conversation happening around the world. And again, as COVID-19 has shown us, these kinds of problems are global. They're not local. They impact us locally, but they affect everyone. And so the purpose of ONDRI is really to be in that combination spot where we're working locally, we're taking advantages of the healthcare system in Ontario, the population of Ontario, the ethnic diversity in Ontario, the routine administrative data sets, and the clinical and research leaders that we have that impact worldwide. And yet thinking about how that care can actually work with the system in the Greater Toronto Area or Kingston or smaller towns in Northern Ontario, for example. So we really need to take the global battle into the local setting and then take our findings and contribute them to the global conversation. And that's what this AIM is all about. In the AIM 4, we talked about focusing on health services research, using the health administrative data at the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, ISIS. Like I said, there's nothing in medicine that acronyms can't make more annoying. And this is where all of our health information records are stored. When we encounter a physician, when we order a blood test, this is where the fact that it happened is stored. Not the results, but just the fact that we were in a hospital, or that we had an MRI, or that we saw our family doctor. And we can use that data to look at the impact of our findings, or even of changes in the way we administer healthcare, or in behavioral changes or medication changes, and look at how that impacts people months or years down the road. We have been trying to characterize health service use and costs for people with neurodegenerative diseases, develop approaches to find people. So, for example, there's not a great code for ALS in the OHIP data. And so we have to find ways to identify people with ALS in this administrative data and make sure that we're getting the right people. And as I mentioned earlier, facilitating these pragmatic trials using administrative data as outcomes, and using the data that can inform the decisions that we make in clinical practice. BrainCode is the database that Mario was alluding to, where we store ONDRI and all of OBI data sets. And we've actually, through ONDRI and through some of my own research, we've developed and validated a pipeline to connect OBI data sets and data stored in BrainCode, like the ONDRI data, to connect it to the administrative data held at ISIS, which is going to facilitate all of the things that we're talking about. So just to give you some examples of what's happening in health services research, we'll go to the next slide. So this was a study where we looked at different phases of illness in people with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. This study is actually still ongoing. It's not published yet. We've got the data and we're kind of in the midst of analyzing this. This is led by Susan Bronskill and Laura McLaughlin. And we have a diagnosis date that we define in the administrative database as, maybe not the day the family received the diagnosis, but the day they meet criteria that we can find in the administrative data sets. And we look up to a year after that phase. We look back for a year, and then we follow people long-term and look at these different phases: pre-diagnosis, initial phase, ongoing phase, and end-stage disease, to look at what are the drivers of costs to the system. This helps inform governments as to where to invest resources, but it also helps us inform the kinds of care that we're giving patients. Are we doing tests unnecessarily? Are we not doing enough tests? Are there things that we could change that might help maintain people in the community better, for example? So this is about optimizing our healthcare throughout the different phases of disease. We also, in ONDRI, I hope you're getting the sense that our big theme is cross-disease, multimorbidity, the interactions, as Mario was mentioning, stroke and Alzheimer's and Lewy body and Parkinson's pathologies all kind of overlap. And ALS and frontotemporal dementia and Alzheimer's disease and vascular disease all overlap. And so we're going to be, we are in the midst of doing a study right now looking at these multi-disorders and how that impacts people's interaction with the healthcare system, how that impacts their function, their independence, their trips to the emergency room, and so on. So this may be looking at the interaction between, as Mario mentioned, late life depression and future diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, looking at stroke and its unmasking of dementia, looking at the overlap between Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, and psychiatric comorbidities. This will help us to try to focus on the most vulnerable people to change their outcomes, and to say, maybe if we do a better job of treating the neuropsychiatric complications, we can also improve their independence and their function and prevent people from having to go to long-term care, for example. And so that's the thrust of this. I was alluding before that we are going to be releasing the GOLD, the AIM-1 data, in the fall of this year to the world. We are hoping to make a big splash of this, and we very much appreciate the help of Alzheimer Society and our partner organizations to help us promote this to clinicians and scientists in Ontario, in Canada, and around the world. We want people to use the data that we have extremely laboriously and extremely expensively collected, but also lovingly curated, painstakingly curated, so that it is really well documented and clean data that people will be able to use and comprehend for many years and in many different ways. And so we're excited if there are people who are interested in partnering with us to mine the gold, and if Alzheimer's Society is interested in working with us to leverage that, in whether it be funding people who want to come and mine the gold, or students or trainees who might be interested in accessing the data for discovery purposes. We're very interested and supportive of that from all the different disease perspective, Alzheimer's disease, but also heart and stroke and Parkinson's and so on. And there is more data to leverage and take advantage of than we have, than the 100 scientists and clinicians that are involved in ONDRI have the time to take advantage of. So this data is incredibly rich, literally many millions of data elements and data sets that people can use to make discoveries. So this is one large area that we're interested in. We're also interested in discussing how and whether, and actually getting feedback on our new studies as we're launching them. So promoting health in aging and neurodegenerative diseases and dementia in Ontario, the HANDS study, is a platform study. We're going to be launching kind of a core set of elements that we're going to be using to explore disease-specific and cross-disease questions. So participants are going to hopefully agree to allow us to link to administrative health data and ISIS. They're going to provide a biosample that can be used for basic discovery about markers of disease and stability and decline. We have a very sophisticated partner called Sybil Inc., who is through Northwestern and Chicago, has developed these remote wearable biosensors that are soft, even though they're sensors, and tiny little chips so that they can be worn on the chest or on the wrist and help us improve self-management. So we are using these to develop measures of agitation, aggression, delirium, tremor, activity, exercise. They can detect atrial fibrillation. They can actually detect cough counts and temperature, so they can be used to monitor for COVID symptoms. The possibilities in here are quite significant. They're actually giving an ambulatory sleep assessment, as well as ambulatory blood pressure and cardiac monitoring. And so we actually are working with patients and family members and caregivers, as well as physicians, primary care physicians, to say, we are able to collect so much data. The question is, how do you want that data, and how can you best use that data for your own care and your own self-management in your day-to-day real-world life? And how can we get that data to your physician in a way that's useful and doesn't overwhelm them with literally billions of data elements? So we're looking at launching studies in Alzheimer's disease, MCI, Parkinson's, and ALS to start, where these devices can be used to help self-management. And at the same time, we're going to be collecting some basic science like blood samples for DNA and blood-based biomarkers of disease. All of it stored in brain code and linkable to ISIS. We are looking for people who might be interested in participating and collaborating with us on our Patient and Community Advisory Committee, something that Christina can tell you more about as well. And Ruth are both excellent contact people for this. And we look to the PCAC to be active partners in our research, helping us design our research protocols, helping us set priorities and say, you know what, that's all well and good from a discovery point of view, but I want something that's going to help me with my blank, tremor, agitation, sundowning, mood, activity. So am I getting out enough? Social interactivity. Are we actually, when somebody goes to a program, for example, are they really interacting with people? Or that chest sensor I was talking about has the capacity to actually detect talk time and speech interaction, so we can look at how socially interactive people are. And so some of our research projects are actually being co-designed with patients and caregivers and family members to set those priorities. We're always looking for community relationships that we can develop to help accelerate our discovery, but also help move it back into practice so that it impacts people. That's the story of ONDRI and OBI, is it's not just about discovery research. Certainly we're doing what we hope and believe is world-class science, but we don't want this to be a paper in a journal on a library shelf somewhere. We want it to be living, breathing, and impactful in the real world for individuals. And that's really the motivation behind what we're doing, and especially in ONDRI 2, where our focus is. So some examples of ways in which Ruth and Stephanie in our program have been helping us to drive these, the impact is translating some of what we're doing in the research world into people's homes and people's lives. We produced an infographic and had numerous, social media and actually media interviews on CTV and so on about, this was very early on in March, we brought together the Alzheimer Society, Heart and Stroke, Parkinson's, ALS Society. So all of these organizations cross-promoted this message that we co-developed with our PCAC and these different organizations to say, yes, we have to physically distance. This was even before the lingo had switched from social distancing to physical distancing. So we have to physical distance, yes, but not socially isolate. And some suggestions and approaches for how to make sure that that happens. Getting the messages out as far as our discoveries, like you saw that infographic on the MRI paper that we've been doing. We've had a webinar that people can access online if you're interested about taking care of body, mind, and soul during the COVID-19 pandemic. We would like to be a key accelerator to breaking down the silos between neurodegenerative diseases, because people with Parkinson's disease or stroke get dementia, and people with dementia have problems with movement, or maybe at risk for falls, or may have issues with heart and stroke, may have heart failure or stroke issues. So ONDRI lives in the crossover space, and our goal is really to bring together all of our partner organizations and community agencies, primary care, patients and carers and volunteers to really try to make that impact across diseases. So if you know people who might be interested in participating with our Patient Community Advisory Committee, please have them contact us. Consider talking to your clients about engaging in ONDRI at Home or the new HANDS-ONT Ontario research studies as they get launched. These are just beginning to start up, so we're not quite ready yet, but we will be, and certainly we'll be happy to take names of interested people that we could contact. And importantly, because a lot of this is remote and wearable, it's stuff that we can do during the pandemic without actually knocking on people's doors and going into their houses or bringing them into the hospital. We can mail and FedEx out packages, we can video or telephone with people to give them instructions, and they can actually, in their day-to-day lives, still participate in research and help us accelerate discovery even during these unique times. Certainly, if you're interested in collaborating with us to look at ways or ask questions that might be addressable by mining our gold, we're very open to that. So if there are people who want to collaborate, or if there's an interest in funding, instead of necessarily paying people to go collect mountains of new data, we also, increasingly, funding agencies are recognizing there's a value of exploiting the data we already have. So I just want to thank you again for the opportunity, and both Dr. Maselli, Dr. Munoz, and I are happy to take questions.
So thank you very much for the information. I think even as a PCAC member, each time I hear about the studies and the upcoming objectives of the various aims, there's always new information, number one. And number two, it's really exciting because ONDRI lives and breathes, to your point, this notion of applicability and real world, as opposed to being embedded, in the journals and on paper, which is lovely, but, it's really, especially from an Alzheimer Society perspective, how we can make a difference and bring knowledge to action is really where, it helps us help our clients. And so I have a question that I'd like to ask on behalf of the group. And I also want to point out a piece around funding. So just for the participants that are here, to let you know that I have linked ONDRI with the Alzheimer Society of Canada that has the really strong research arm and funding potential. Whereas the Alzheimer Society of Ontario is more along the lines of providing the direct client service through counseling and education and so forth. So to that end, with respect to this notion of helping clients to connect to ONDRI, either as a participant, but even as an opportunity to learn more about what's happening with respect to ONDRI in general over time, because we know that there's papers being continually published and new findings. Where can we direct our clients to go to learn some of these new findings and opportunities?
So thank you. That's a great point. We are going to provide you with a link to our website and our social media channels, because that's probably the best way to stay in the loop. So Ruth, I don't know if you want to speak to that as well.
Sorry, I had to mute myself. Yeah, I mean, we've got, as Dr. Swartz mentioned, we've got ONDRI.ca as our website. If you want to send a message to someone in the program management team, the best way is info@ONDRI.ca. So info@ONDRI.ca, and we'll connect you to whatever resource will get you the answer that you need. So those are the probably, and watch out for our ONDRI Twitter account. We're on YouTube, as well as a little bit of a presence on Instagram and Facebook.
Thank you for that. And so we have 5 minutes left for questions from anyone in the group, and also think that we have limited time. If you do happen to have a question that we're not able to address within these 5 minutes, I'm happy to send them through to the ONDRI team to answer at a later time. So I'm seeing some thank yous in the chat pod, and that is awesome work. Are there any specific questions about any of the studies or the ONDRI platform? So I can think of 2 questions that occurred to me when I was listening to the presentation. Certainly with respect to the Beaton paper, around caregiver burden. Certainly we know as we support care partners, and actually they're predominantly the clients that we serve, we know that this is a huge issue and certainly being further highlighted through the COVID situation. I'm not sure if you're able to comment on any of the top findings in that paper that speak to sort of the shared experience of caregiver burden across the various diseases or not.
Sure. I mean, the paper is not yet out, but to give a sneak peek, I mean, I think it's in some ways it's research that I think care partners may say, we could have told you this ages ago, but we certainly see interesting differences between the groups. So care partners of persons with ALS, for example, are much more concerned about the immediate short-term time horizon and meeting, for example, physical care needs, wheelchairs and getting up and down stairs and bathrooms and things like that. Whereas that, maybe a partial concern for persons with Parkinson's disease and less of a concern for MCI or Alzheimer's disease. We certainly see the burden on caregivers increases significantly when there is a greater severity of motor disease, but also greater severity, obviously, of cognitive disorders. So in the mild cognitive impairment stage is very different than later stage dementia. And interestingly, I think we teased out, I don't have time to go into it in a lot of detail, but different domains of concerns from, sort of planning the future as far as care needs to financial burdens and managing financial concerns, to just stress and either physical or psychological burnout on caregivers. So I think these multiple different areas are all important, I think, for care partners.
Thank you for that. And I think studies like that, to your point, although, we hear it anecdotally in the supports that we're providing, it's nice to have the validation and to further justify our strategic plans in the way that we support our clients. I am seeing a number of questions starting to surface. So there's thank yous again. There is a question about the PCAC. Do you have to meet physically or will the meetings be online? So I can answer that one. They are indeed virtual. And there are periodic meetings in person as well, a few times per year.
That was before COVID. So before COVID, they were largely virtual with a few in person, and at the moment, everything's virtual. Even those few in persons have been made virtual. And once it's safe to gather people together again, we hope to do that on a semi-regular basis. And can support people, coming in from out of town. Used to support people coming in from out of town, because this is Pan-Ontario. So for the once or twice a year where we try to meet face-to-face, we could support people who had to travel if they wanted to, but certainly also supporting virtual options. And obviously, I think in the foreseeable near term, in the next 6 to 12 months, we're not thinking about a lot of face-to-face meetings right now.
Indeed. Thank you. And the final question for today, noting the time, is where can we see the eligibility criteria for the upcoming studies? Also, our clients whom do not have a care partner involved, are they eligible for studies? As we understand, it can be difficult to get the collateral information.
So those are two great questions. The eligibility study criteria for the upcoming studies are still being finalized, and research ethics board approvals being obtained and so on. So we can't actually advertise for those until we have REB approval to do so. But watching the ONDRI website and the social media feeds are probably going to be the best bet. So the ONDRI.ca that Ruth was talking about is probably the simplest way, or following the Twitter or Instagram accounts. Because as we get those REB approvals coming online, we're going to be starting to promote those studies. Some of them will be looking quite broadly. Some of them will be focused on an individual disease basis or even individual site because of REB restrictions and so on. So we would apologize in advance if there's a study going on that people aren't able to enroll in, but we're also very, very open and interested to keeping track of people who sort of put their hand up and say, when you have something for me, let me know. We'd really appreciate that. As far as the lack of care partner, ONDRI 1, that was a requirement to participate in ONDRI 1. It is not a requirement to participate in ONDRI 2 for the very reasons outlined in the question.
Thank you. So to conclude for today, I think what is really amazing about this presentation is it now has provided the foundational knowledge about ONDRI, past, present, and future. And in addition to visiting the website, certainly as a representative of PCAC and of the Alzheimer Society of Ontario, I too can periodically share information to the group, and they will understand then sort of the origin of the information and the purpose behind it. So I really think this ongoing collaboration is quite an opportunity. So again, thank you for providing this information to us today collectively. It again has provided a wealth of information. And to those having joined today, thank you. And certainly if you do think of other questions, as mentioned before, I'm happy to filter them through to the ONDRI team. Thank you, everyone. And I wish you a very lovely rest of the day.
Thanks
Thank
so
you
much.
very much for having us.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.